Hey, my name is Danielle Ainsley, and it is such a pleasure to have you all here with us. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which all of us are on, being conscious that we have people not just from all over New South Wales, but also Victoria and I think Western Australia too. So I'm on the country of Gadigal and Birrabirragal people of the Eora Nation this evening, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It is also a pleasure to welcome both Ailsa Piper and Hugh Mackay this evening. Ailsa has made a life in the arts for over 40 years, working as an actor, director, speaker and teacher. She has written for theatre and radio, as well as writing 2 very popular books. She mentors, she leads workshops, retreats, and occasionally performs solo works based on her books. She has judged the New South Wales and Victorian Premier's Literary Awards and is an accomplished moderator of conversations at libraries and festivals. Now, Hugh Mackay is a social psychologist and the author of 22 books, including 8 novels. His non-fiction writing covers social analysis, psychology, communication, and ethics. He has a 60-year career in social research, is a fellow of the Australian Psychological Society and of the Royal Society of New South Wales, and has been awarded honorary doctorates by 5 Australian universities. He was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2015 and is currently an honorary professor in the Research School of Psychology at ANU. It's a treat for us to hear more about your latest book, Hugh, The Kindness Revolution. So there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the conversation. For those of you that are joining us online, you'll notice there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, so please type your questions there and we'll be able to answer those. And for those of you who are in person tonight, we will have a roving microphone, so there will be a chance to ask your questions too. So now I'll hand it over to Elsa.
Thanks so much, Danielle. And it's a great pleasure to be here on the coldest day in Sydney in 37 years. I think it's Hugh's fault because he's brought the weather from Canberra, but anyway. Someone said to me that I was going to be talking to the Yoda of Australian literature tonight. I don't think Yoda's nearly as attractive as Hugh, but anyway. But we're here to talk...
Was that intended as an insult?
Well, I think it's your great wisdom that's being acknowledged, which I know that you will... That's it. And I know that you will deny it all night long if we try to get into wisdom, so we'll leave it at the door. I thought that before we go into the actual book itself, we might define our terms, if that's okay with you. So throughout the course of the Kindness Revolution, Hugh talks about kindness in different ways, but my favourite definition that you give is that kindness is the only form of love that can exist independently of affection. I rather like that. Can you just open that up a bit?
Yes, to step back slightly, the concept of kindness, understanding the concept of kindness, I think depends on reminding ourselves that we belong to a social species. Because we belong to a social species, we've been hardwired for cooperation, which in turn means we've been hardwired for kindness. We're on the planet not only to nurture the planet because it sustains us, but to nurture each other because that's how this species will survive, let alone thrive.
Well, so can I hold you there, because I can feel already a little whisper through the audience. Hardwired for kindness.
Well, neuroscientists, I didn't use that term lightly. Neuroscientists can now peep into our brains in a way that psychologists and philosophers could previously only speculate about. And so they've identified the cooperative centre in the human brain. This is not shocking, is it? This is not amazing. Of course, given what kind of species we are, like many other species on the planet, the social species, we need each other, we need groups, we need communities, we need families, neighbourhoods, colleagues to sustain us and nurture us and to give us that all-important sense of belonging, which is so fundamental to our mental and emotional health. So naturally, we are equipped, genetically equipped for cooperation, which means, as one American neuroscientist recently wrote, we are hardwired for the golden rule. That part of our basic equipment is to be kind, to be respectful towards each other. That's a natural human tendency. It's a resource that we don't always use it, we don't always value it. But I think of it as the most precious asset our species possesses. So it's all about responding to the needs of other people. That's what kindness is about. But you mentioned a particular perspective on it, which I think is also very important. I think of kindness as perhaps the purest manifestation of human love. Now, all manifestations of human love are wonderful. Romantic love is exciting and energizing. Familial love is remarkable, allowing us to love people that don't always appeal to us, but their blood is thicker than water, all that stuff. And companionate love, of course, is life-sustaining. Where would we be without the love of friends, without the support of friendship circles? But then there's this other absolutely unique form of human love, but it's still, I believe, a form of human love, the finest, the noblest, the truest form of human love, kindness. And it's unique because it's the only form of human love that doesn't call on our emotions at all. We don't have to feel anything in order to be kind, except human. We don't have to experience affection. Samuel Johnson, very wise, I don't agree with everything Samuel Johnson wrote, but old Sam got it right with this particular line that kindness is in our power even when fondness is not. Isn't it fantastic to belong to a species of whom we can say that? We are capable of being kind to people we don't like. Fantastic. We are capable of being kind to people we could never agree with about religion or politics or literature or art or anything. We are even, isn't this remarkable? We are even capable of being kind to total strangers who we may never see again. And it comes naturally to us because it's built into us. So you see someone in need, you don't say, "How did you vote at the last election?" or "Do you believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus?" You don't qualify them to determine whether they're worth acting kindly towards you. Not a second thought, not a backward glance. They need help, you have to. That's what humans do because that's our natural propensity. And you don't do it because of affection. There's no emotion in it at all. There can be. Of course, we can be kind to our friends. We can be kind to people we love. But the phenomenon of kindness is free of emotion.
And do you think then, if we're talking about something evolutionary, because it's in our brains, in our systems, do you think we're evolving and getting kinder? Because everything around me suggests perhaps that we're not.
No.
So what do you think in terms of the way we're evolving?
Well, evolution happens so slowly, we can't take a snapshot.
I'm very old.
Even your lifetime is not long enough for us to observe it. Although people do say that the thumb is making an evolutionary leap because of people doing their smartphones with their two thumbs. No, we can't get a long enough view. But what I would suggest is we are innately neither more or less kind than we've ever been. But remember that the capacity for kindness doesn't guarantee kindness. I mean, we are born also with a speech centre in our brain, but that doesn't mean we spring from the womb speaking the mother tongue. It has to be, the capacity is there, but it has to be nurtured. We have to be taught and corrected and so on, guided. And it's the same with kindness. Even though I've suggested it's our most precious asset as humans, I would also say it's probably our most undervalued asset. It's very easily brushed aside in favour of ambition or a competitive urge or rampant individualism. The ego is the great enemy of kindness. So the point that you're making or questioning about, I think is really valid, not in terms of an evolutionary process, but a process of social evolution. If we look at Australia in the last 30 or 40 years, well within your lifetime, even more within mine, not only Australia, but Western societies in general, look at the social changes which have been reshaping our society. Things like our shrinking households. Within the next 10 years, every third household in Australia will contain just one person. That's not the kind of society any of us grew up in. There's a potential there for terrible loneliness on a large scale, and we already have an epidemic of loneliness. Our plummeting birth rate. Kids are a kind of social lubricant in most communities. You move into a new neighbourhood, it's usually the kids who get to know each other first, and then the networks build from that. We're producing, relative to total population, the smallest generation of children ever in our history. So that social lubricant is in short supply. I'll explain the point of this in a moment. Our extreme busyness is another one of the busyness has been elevated to the status of a social virtue.
Oh, yeah.
How are you going? Ailsa, busy?
And if you're not, you're a total loss.
Might as well be dead. I mean, the switch is either on or off. You're busy or you're dead. Well, that's the great enemy of social cohesion, busyness. Too busy. The neighbours have asked us in for drinks. Too busy. Those things, plus, of course, the information technology revolution, which has reshaped our lives profoundly and accelerated the process during the pandemic. A paradoxical revolution. On the one hand, promising that we'll be more connected than ever, which we are. On the other hand, making it easier than ever for us to stay apart.
And social media is the least kind place that I can think of in the world.
Yes. Well, let's digress for a moment before I get to where that series of trends is taking us. The social media phenomenon is a breeding ground for unkindness, and there are good reasons for that. One is anonymity. You can do and say what you like, and no one, I mean, among friends, it's a great augmenter of relationships, but so much of what happens in social media is not among friends, it's among unknown strangers. We assume, we don't know who they are, who are trolling and flaming and abusing and bullying and so on. So anonymity often brings out the worst in us. But the other curious thing about social media is that it's an illusory form of social, it's cleverly called social media. It's actually anti-social media. It's what you do when you're not socialising. Because socialising is this, we make eye contact, we smile, and there are lots of nuances and subtleties in our interaction. That's rich, and that's how human relationships develop. Online, in social media, whether there's pictures or not, it's totally different, qualitatively different. It's not nurturing our need for social contact. And because we belong to a social species, we all, in the same way as we all get hungry when we need food, we all have a need of, you could say, a daily dose of social contact. Some people's social needs are higher than others. But if your social needs are not being met, and they are not being met online, they can't be because it's not social. It's technology. You think you're looking at someone, but you're looking at a screen. There's no actual eye contact, which is the expressway to the heart. That's missing. So when we're dealing with social media, we are sacrificing social contact, which means that all that time on social media is time when we're depriving ourselves of social contact. If our social contact needs are not met, we behave like people whose nutrition needs are not met. They get hungry. And what happens to humans when their social contact needs are not being met? Very typically, they become angry, grumpy, irritable, and they usually don't know why. They're just angry. Not because someone did or said something that made them angry, but their social needs are unmet. So you can be a heavy user of social media, sacrificing your daily dose of social contact, and it comes out as anger, which is why there is so much anger on social media. I mean, you can also feel deeply lonely. The phenomenon in contemporary, point I was about to make, but I'll just make this point because I think it is important. Social media, because it's not personal communication, it's not social contact, also promotes loneliness. So in Australia, by the way, just a contextual point, 25% of Australians report feeling lonely most of the time. That's where our society has got to. Well, that brings us back to the theme we were actually on. But the age group reporting the highest level of loneliness is the 18 to 24 age group, who are also the heaviest users of social media. So social analysts now talk about connected but lonely, and that's a term that makes sense. And in the book, I've introduced a parallel term, connected but angry. So just back now to the social changes that I was talking about that's an important part of this. But put all those things together, especially social media, but the other things, another one I should have mentioned, the high rate of relationship breakdown.
Yeah.
Between 35 and 40% of contemporary marriages are ending in divorce. Put all those things that I mentioned together, the cumulative effect over the last 30 or 40 years has looked like an evolutionary change. It's promoted individualism. And so we've entered an era of rampant individualism, what many commentators have now described as the me culture, the obsession with... We used to say of someone as a kind of insult, oh, he's always looking out for number one. Now it's recommended, look out for number one. And this is a symptom of the me culture, of the era of rampant individualism. And because all of those social changes have promoted social fragmentation. We've thought of ourselves much more as individuals, unique, special, different, independent, rather than as members of neighbourhoods, communities, utterly interdependent. So before the pandemic hit, the trend in our society had been pushing us towards rampant individualism and social fragmentation, what sociologists describe as atomization, an atomized society where we're all little disconnected individuals. Now, that's a deeply unhealthy state for us to be in, of course.
But then we've got an unhealthy thing called COVID.
And then we got a circuit breaker. Yeah, we got a jolt, we got a shock. And we need shocks like this. I was talking to an American academic, just a retired academic a couple of weeks ago, who early in his career had gone to work in London in the early 50s, just after the end of World War II. And he said he was initially shocked by the number of people he spoke to who said, we really missed the war. How could you miss the war? Well, of course, we don't miss the bombs, we don't miss the rubble, we don't miss the death and destruction. What we miss is the sense of utter solidarity.
And the kindness.
And the kindness, the absolutely uninhibited kindness, the sense of any sacrifice we have to make for the good of others, we will automatically make. The Great Depression did that to a generation of Australians.
The making of us.
Who said later on.
You started the book, the opening sentence, I'm just looking at my notes here to see if I can find it. The opening sentence of this book is, we had never previously witnessed an outpouring of love like it, referring to COVID. And I had never thought of it like that. I mean, in a weird way, that's a wonderful reframing of COVID, or at least of the early stages, perhaps. Tell me what you observed at that time, and what gives you hope that it can continue.
Yes, I think it was a mass outpouring of love. The love of the kind we're talking about, the emotionless, affectionless kindness, the empty car parks, the empty school playgrounds, people working from home, wearing masks, keeping their distance, all that sort of stuff.
That was a reframe for me. I had not thought of lockdown as a loving act for the whole community.
We did it for each other.
Loving, yeah.
We made sacrifices. We accepted inconvenience for the common good. Now, some cynics will say, well, we were looking after our own health. And of course, that's part of it too. I mean, we have to be kind to ourselves. It's like the masks that drop down in an aircraft, the oxygen mask. You know, they always say in the safety instructions, fit your own mask before you try to help someone else. We've got to be kind to ourselves. We've got to look after ourselves to equip us for the very demanding business of belonging to this species. It's a tough gig being a member of a social species. So cynics might say, oh, we were just obeying the rules. You know, we were told to stay home, so we stayed home. You know, we're an acquiescent mob. Well, of course, we needed guidance about how we should express our concern and our care for each other. And early on, many people panicked. Many people were fearful. And panic and fear bring out the worst in us, generally speaking. But very quickly, as is usually the case when there's a catastrophe or a crisis, on a societal scale or on a personal scale, a health scare, a relationship breakdown, a retrenchment, a bereavement. These things initially produce bad responses in us until we learn how to deal with it, until we learn how to channel our response. And then the kindness response usually prevails, as it did in this case. So, yes, we were playing by the rules. The rules were there to guide us, but didn't you hear, didn't everyone hear, didn't we all hear all over Australia wonderful stories of people responding to the lockdown in particular in ways that had nothing to do with playing by the rules. It was nothing to do with wearing a mask or keeping a distance. It was rediscovering the neighbourhood. It was remembering that old guy at the end of the street is pretty frail and maybe needs a bit of a hand, or realising a common problem in cities like Sydney and Melbourne that we've never actually met our neighbours. So maybe this is the moment when we need to know who they are.
Do you think that can last, though? I mean, I'm curious about that, because I feel like already I'm hearing people being anxious to get back to what we were.
Yes.
And do you think...
My anxiety is exactly the opposite. I'm anxious that we should not get back, hence the word revolution.
Yes. Yeah.
What I'm suggesting is we need to turn the crisis into a revolution. We need to think about the ways we live differently under the influence of any crisis or catastrophe, but let's just think about this one. Under the influence, and this may not have been a big enough jolt. It's not as bad as the war. It's not as bad as the Great Depression.
And particularly not in Australia.
Yes.
With respect to those in Melbourne on their last night of
Yes, and people whose livelihood was lost and people who had terrible health consequences. Many people suffered. But it might not have been a big enough jolt. I'm hoping that it was, because my dream is that we will internalise these lessons and decide to apply them more generally, not just in our personal lives, but in our political culture as well. But just think of one example, a personal example that I had of going beyond the rules. Very early in the pandemic, I was involved in the lockdown, the first lockdown. I was involved in a webinar.
Your favourite word?
A word that I think should have been strangled at birth. We know what a webinar is. So I was there and talking about the effects of the pandemic. And as usual in a webinar, you get siphoned off into little subgroups. And I was in a little subgroup just with two other blokes, both by the look of them in their early 30s. One in Melbourne, one in Sydney. They didn't know each other. I was in Canberra. And by coincidence, these two young men had recently moved house. So they moved into new accommodation in a new suburb, one in Melbourne, one in Sydney, where they knew no one, and then suddenly lockdown. So what did they do? By coincidence, they both did exactly the same thing. They wrote little notes in which they said, I'm new to the street, don't know anyone here, but here's my phone number. If you need help with shopping or picking up a prescription or having your lawn mowed or something, give us a call. and they distributed these little notes in letterboxes around their street. Now, would they have done that if there had not been a lockdown? Would they have done that if there had not been a potential catastrophe that we were facing? Almost certainly not. They would have just moved in the way we do move into new accommodation, look around, the neighbours are all a bit weird, wonder if they'll ever get to know each other, probably not. They look at us, think we're weird, because we're all weird, and then you get to know each other and the weirdness matters less. That might have happened, or they might have just lived their lives without ever getting to know the people in that street, which is an increasingly common problem in the era of individualism.
Yes.
But they didn't. So they were immediately integrated. Another little story I heard, a friend of mine who's a grandmother in Melbourne, she was living with her daughter and 2-year-old granddaughter in the lockdown. And they developed the habit every Saturday of going to the local farmer's market, buying a bag of oranges and putting the oranges in the 2-year-old's pram. And they were walking up and down the street, knocking on everyone's door, offering them an orange.
Oh.
And of course, everyone was accepting the orange from a cute 2-year-old. and that went on for the duration of the first lockdown. And they said the change in the kind of ethos of that street was remarkable. People who didn't know each other previously or didn't acknowledge each other were smiling and waving, and it brought the street there. Now, you can multiply those stories many, many times. It's all about, in a crisis, recognising that actually our individuality, our personal identity, our sense of uniqueness and difference and independence, all the stuff that became so fashionable in the full flowering of the individualist era, identity politics, all that stuff. Identity important, I'm not downplaying identity, but nowhere near as significant as the essential point about us that we share a common humanity. And a crisis always reminds us of that we are connected by this invisible web of interdependency.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I don't know about others, but I don't necessarily feel that I have seen that played out in our public spaces all the time. I feel like I'm watching things happening at the ground, and you say a revolution begins at the bottom and works its way up. And I would like to think that that's so, but I suppose I feel less optimistic about the kind of leadership I'm seeing. And we keep hearing our leaders telling us that they're listening. And I want to talk about listening because one of the things that Hugh maintains in the book is that listening is the greatest kindness we can do. And I think if that's the case, then maybe we're listening to each other individually and in groups like this, but I don't always get a feeling that at the top we're being listened to particularly well. How do you think it translates all this sort of fond feeling and kindness to up the scale?
Well, at the moment, not, generally speaking. And
I don't just mean politics, I mean business, I mean religion, I mean wherever you want to look.
Yes. Revolutions such as this one will always be slow. Look at the gender revolution. Second wave feminism hit Australia in the 70s. Here we are in 2021. Society has been utterly transformed by the gender revolution, and we still have a long way to go, all these decades later. So it's not an overnight thing. My argument is that if we let us for a moment dream of a different kind of society. If you dreamed of Australia being a bit different, what would you dream of? Would you say, I wish we were a bit more violent. I wish people didn't waste so many words and just hit each other when they feel angry. I wish people, but why are people so nice to each other? Why can't we just be a bit tougher? Of course not. No one has that sort of silly dream. It's a universal dream of a society in which we are kinder, more compassionate, more respectful, more inclusive, more tolerant, more harmonious, less cynical, etc. Now, if we want that kind of society to come about, it won't come about in 24 hours, and we won't get a message from the top about how to do it, and we shouldn't be looking. People who say they look to the federal parliament for moral leadership, I don't know why. I don't. But in some other countries you might. I mean, some of us look rather enviously across the Tasman and say, there's an example of kindness at the top. It can happen. There are remarks. Nelson Mandela was a political leader suffused with the spirit of kindness, no question. But these are rare cases. Generally speaking, presidents, prime ministers, premiers, chief executives, etc., are not going to try and shake up the culture because the culture as it was is what made them. Why are they going to say there's something wrong with the system? If I'm prime minister, there's clearly something wrong. No, there's clearly something right. I got the top job. And of course, the system is antithetical to listening. The system is antithetical to kindness. The system that we've inherited from the so-called Mother Parliament is an adversarial system based on constant competition, rivalry, winners and losers. And if that's the model, then listening, being kind, being generous, being inclusive is antithetical to the structure of the system itself. Even the way we sit in Parliament promotes that. I've got some other suggestions in the book about how we can even change that. But so that's not going to be quick. But the rising tide of kindness will reach the ballot box. We will start to be thinking of kindness as one of the criteria against which we should judge any policy, social, economic, or other policy. Is it kind? Is it fair? First, then we can ask other questions about it. We can start demanding of our members of Parliament that they start to think like this. Are they going to resist it? Are they going to say, no, we won't take kindness into account? If enough of us are badgering them, they'll start to get that message. We need to be questioning candidates. Maybe we need to be becoming candidates. We need to be influencing imagine if the kind of society we dream of started to evolve and the political culture was changed within the next, not in my lifetime almost, so let's say within the next 25 years. That's a reasonable hope. So much would change. Our attitude to reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians would be transformed. Our care of the frail elderly would be transformed. We'd have a completely different view about how to deal with people for whom we have no work. We'd have a completely different view of homelessness and poverty. There's a long list of agenda items that would be differently framed, differently approached.
But don't you think it's interesting that at a time when we're seeing all this sort of unity at ground level, it feels like the conversation, and I don't just mean in Australia, the conversation, the listening that you're talking about has become almost impossible, it would seem. Those moments that we did once see of two sides, opposing sides of politics, agreeing on something seems so rare now. Which brings me to this is one of your central, I suppose, chapters about listening. So it's one thing for us to be here listening, and this is a very mature and beautiful way in which to have a conversation, it seems to me, that people can listen, just to be able to listen for half an hour. But how do we get that to happen beyond sort of rooms in which people have agreed to do it? I don't know how that, and in a way that seems to me to have got worse through the period of COVID. Again, I say, not just in Australia, I suppose. Well, anyway, let me ask you what you think about that.
Yeah, well, again, I think it's a grassroots movement. Let's just say a few things about listening, and then we can see why it's harder in some contexts than others. You alluded to this earlier on, Ailsa. I think of listening as the most potent symbol of kindness there is. And I justify that by going back to the basic proposition that we are members of a social species. Being members of a social species, our deepest social need is to be noticed, to be heard, to be appreciated, to be acknowledged. That's what makes us thrive. And when that sense is deprived or diminished, we tend to behave very badly, including even violently. when we feel as if we're not being understood, appreciated, listened to, and so on. So listening is the most obvious way I can show you that I take you seriously. When I listen to you, when people listen to us talking now, we're encouraged, aren't we? Because the unspoken, if people are muttering and, we could hear the click of smartphones and we'd be a bit miffed. But when people are attentively listening, and we assume even empathically listening, the unspoken message is, I take you seriously enough as a person to bother listening to you. But if I don't listen, or if I half listen, or if you can tell that I'm just pretending to listen, I'm looking at my watch or looking over your shoulder or something, the unspoken message is, sorry, Elsa, I don't take you seriously enough to bother listening to you. Now, I would never say that to you, because how hurt would you be if I said that, or if any of us said it to a partner or a child or a colleague or a neighbour or a friend? Sorry, I don't take you seriously enough to bother listening. You wouldn't say it. And yet we do say it without using words every time we withhold the intensely therapeutic gift of listening. Now, having said that, it's important to acknowledge that listening doesn't come easily. I mean, it's like I was saying about the speech centre, and we need to nurture it. The kindness propensity that we have should fuel our ability to listen. But the tendency, the disposition for kindness is there, but listening, partly because it is one of the most potent expressions of kindness, is quite hard for us to do. And the reason that it's hard for us to do is, I've used a metaphor in the book to describe this. Can I just briefly describe this? I'm inviting people to think of us as being, all of us, as being inside a mind cage. Think of yourself as having an invisible cage around your head. And the bars of that cage are your worldview. The bars of that cage are the framework of knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, prejudices, expectations that you've been gradually putting together since you were about 3, when we were able to lay down permanent memory traces. So everything we learn, everything we think we know, everything we believe goes into our worldview, goes into our system, our framework of attitudes and beliefs. So that's like, it works like a framework around our mind. And of course, inside it, we feel secure and comfortable because we built it. It's the product of our life's experience. We know what we know. We're convinced we're right. Of course we're right. That's what my experience has taught me. Now, the problem is that that it's not only like a cocoon, it's also like a cage. It's also like a filter. So when we look out at the world, we don't see or hear what's there. We see or hear it filtered through the framework of our own attitudes, dispositions, what psychologists describe as selective perception. We tend to see things in terms of what we already believe, so we tend to interpret them as though they would reinforce, as though they'd fit with our view. So all that's background to saying when we listen to someone, this is the most generous thing we ever do, because if you're actually listening to someone, you are stepping outside the comfort and security of your own mind cage and trying to imagine what it's like to be that other person. If you are truly listening attentively and with empathy, you're entertaining another person's ideas. This is a remarkable thing to do. It's a generous thing to do, but it's also expected of members of a social species. Carl Rogers, one of my psychological heroes, talks about needing the courage to listen. And he says it's a courageous act because if we truly listen to another person, we run the risk of being changed by what we hear. And who wants to be changed? Would I have to change my mind if I heard you out? And so we usually don't. We usually interrupt or impose our own views. One of the points I make in the book is that we are not qualified to respond to what someone is saying until we're sure we've got straight what they actually are saying.
And one of the things that I really took to heart in the book, in the listening section, was that you said it's almost impossible to get another person to change their mind by arguing with them. That in fact, the one thing that you will do to actually set someone in their way of thinking is to kind of argue them.
Yes. The law of human communication: attack someone, they will defend.
They will defend.
And in the process of defending, they will have reinforced their existing position.
Which goes to that question again between, are we a cooperative species or a competitive species? Because we are both, aren't we? I mean,
we're a cooperative species who also compete.
Yeah, okay.
Because it's in our nature. There's no competitive centre in the brain. We learn that in certain circumstances. That's not an innate tendency, but through human history we've had to compete for food or water or shelter or sexual partners or whatever it might be. That's true. We're fast learners, but we are in essence a cooperative species. Even some people might have watched suddenly forgotten what it's called, the State of Origin football last night.
Not this person, I'm AFL.
Oh, well, AFL will do, or the French Open, any really, head-to-head sporting contest. It looks like naked competition. It looks like that's the sort of species we are, warlike, aggressive.
Yeah.
Sporting contests are a remarkable demonstration of human cooperation. I mean, when Nadal and Djokovic slug it out on centre court, they're agreeing to play the game of tennis. They're agreeing that those lines will have great significance. The net will have a certain function. There are rules that we'll both follow. And if we don't cooperate, the competition becomes meaningless. We'll accept that the referee, not all tennis players, Caravaggio actually murdered.
That great tennis player.
Yeah, that great tennis player who was also handy with a brush. He murdered his opponent when he lost at a tennis match. Now that's not the cooperative spirit.
No.
So we agree that the only weapon you will use is a racket. So, I mean, there are two ways of looking at this, but, I mean, when you're teaching little kids to play soccer, the first thing you have to teach them is to cooperate.
Yes,
pass the ball, share, learn to cooperate. You can't compete if you can't cooperate. And the reason everyone shakes hands at the end, ritualistically at the end of a sporting contest, is to say we needed each other.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have been fun if we hadn't had a robust competition. It wouldn't have been entertaining for the spectators. There'd be no satisfaction in the game if it hadn't been a cooperative venture.
I feel like I know we could talk on all night, but I'm conscious that there are a lot of people wanting to ask questions, and it's nearly, well, it is time for them. But just before that, there's a very short passage that Hugh's going to read.
Oh, yes.
Just because this book goes so far, but this little section, I think, gives you a taste of a lot of Hugh's concerns. So we'll do this and then we'll throw to questions from the camera or from wherever you are and from here.
Everyone is in need of kindness because everyone walks with shadows. The bereaved with their grief, the arrogant with their deep down insecurities, the believers with their doubt, the lonely with their ache for connection, the uncherished with their fear of insignificance, the ambitious with their vulnerability to failure, the siblings with their rivalry, the bullies with their repressed self-loathing, the errant with their guilt, the anxious and depressed with their dark yearnings, and all those living with the pain of disappointment, frustration, humiliation, rejection, or loss. Kindness is the universal balm for troubled souls. the gift that says, I understand the need for kindness because I share it. To be kind always and to everyone, whether we like them or agree with them or not, is to be fully, gloriously human. And who wants their humanity diminished by mean-spiritedness? A smile, a wave, an offer of help, a word of encouragement or reassurance, every act of kindness is therapeutic and potentially transformative, and one more step towards a better society.
Thanks, Hugh. Thank you. Shall we have a question from away first, just because we can't see?
Yes, please. I was hoping you would say that. So we do have over 270 people joining us online, which is pretty amazing. So we do want to acknowledge you all and thank you for being here. We can't see you, but we know that you're there. And so because of that, there are a lot of questions, as you can imagine, and we obviously have the in-person audience too. So the way that it will work is we'll do one question online, one question from the in-person audience too, and the lovely Erin up the back has a microphone. So whilst we're doing the online question, just pop your hand up or make eye contact with Erin and she'll do her best to come and see you. But our first one is a bit of a curly one for you, Hugh, to kick us off. Why not? Are women kinder than men? And if so, why?
The only incontrovertible evidence about difference in behaviour between men and women is that men are and of course there's a lot of overlap, men are slightly better than women at judging distance. There is certainly a very strong folklore that says women are naturally kinder than men. And neuroscience would say, no, that cannot be true. But it could easily be true that in any given culture, the capacity for kindness is nurtured more in women who, in our culture, we would still typically say tend to be the more nurturing gender, even though there are many exceptions. There are many non-nurturing women and many highly nurturing men. It's a continuum. But that is probably a fair statement, that in our culture, at its present stage of cultural evolution, women tend to have their kindness potential nurtured and less likely to have the ego at war with the kindness potential. I have a very curious example of this through my research career. One of the techniques that I sometimes used in social research was to have small groups of people, friends, neighbours, meeting in their homes, not answering questions, but having a discussion about the topic. And one of the things I noticed over decades was that women were much more efficient talkers than men. A group of women would typically take less time to cover a topic than a group of men. And the reason was that the men, that ego played too much of a role in the men's groups. They all had to have their say, even if what they wanted to say had already been said, they had to say it as well, whereas women would think, well, someone said that, let's move on. So a women's group might take an hour and a men's group on the same topic might take 90 minutes. So that's another manifestation of a cultural point. There's nothing innate about that. But in our culture historically, and we hope it's changing under the influence of the gender revolution, the ego has been more rampant, more unrestrained among males, and the nurturing tendency has been encouraged more among females. And so that's come out as kindness is often suppressed by egotism in men, and it's often nurtured in women. But that's a cultural difference, not an innate difference.
Thanks for that question, Yvette. That was a good one. Thank you. Now we've got a chance to ask a question from our in-person audience. Anybody? If not, feel free to let it percolate because we have Plenty online. Oh, yep, we've got one with Patty just down here. Here we go.
My question's been brewing since you were talking about social media, Hugh, and in relation to kindness. One of the things that I have noticed that on particular social media groups, there is a great deal of unkindness if you or if anyone questions in any degree, any faintest nuance from the line that's being held. And I'm wondering, is there a relationship between kindness or lack of it and tribalism?
Absolutely. It's a lovely question. Thank you. One of the things about social media or any kind of online connection is the lack of human presence. When we are present to each other, there is much more tendency for kindness because we are responding to the presence of another member of our species. Online, there is no human presence, there's only the illusion of it. And so some of our noblest tendencies can be suppressed and some of our ugliest tendencies can be encouraged. And tribalism is one of them. So the idea of the people in this network, on this medium, whatever the connection is, have a particular line, and if you're not holding that line out, you'll be trolled, you'll be bullied, you'll be laughed off the scene. That wouldn't happen if those people were face to face. If they were present to each other, there'd be adjustments, there'd be communication, argument, compromise, etc. But because there is no human presence, we tend to behave. It's an unnatural environment. So we don't behave another unnatural environment is the car. When we're driving in our little capsules with the windows up, we're capable of saying the most appalling things to our fellow motorists that we would never say face to face. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for that, Patty. So the next question we have is from Kim, and Kim she's very impressed about the idea that one of the number one things for leaders, or their KPI, is that leaders and managers need to have empathy and care for those that they lead. So this is all about kindness and leadership. So how can we, who are the ones who lead, be part of this rising tide of change, and what can we do as individuals?
I'm not sure whether to answer the question by looking at you or by looking at the
I think look at Kim.
I think by looking at the lens.
Yeah.
No, it's a lovely question and an important question. And I would certainly say, there are two models of leadership. One is the power model and one is the service model. If you have the power model of leadership, then you're not remotely interested in listening. You're not remotely interested in empathy. Because if you have the power model, you're saying, I've got the job, I know what's best, do what I say. That should be a classic authoritarian approach to leadership. The alternative is the service approach, which intuitively I think those of us who are led would infinitely prefer, which is to say, I'm here to lead, which is to say I'm here to release your potential, I'm here to encourage cooperation so we can get collective work done. In that case, I will need to understand exactly where you stand. I'll need to listen with great attention and with great empathy to what you're saying so that I can respond to that and incorporate that into the leadership decisions I make. The model of leader as servant is the one that will that's the one that inspires. When we think about leaders through history, whether political, commercial, creative or otherwise, their distinguishing characteristic is that they adopted the service model. Now, when you hear of leaders, or in our case, a government in 2019, engaging a firm of empathy consultants in order to teach them how to look empathic when they're dealing with farmers, $190,000 was spent on these empathy consultants to show government ministers how to look empathic when dealing with farmers who were suffering from that apparently interminable drought. That is mock empathy. That is mock service. It's mock listening. And we see through it immediately, and we become cynical. A leader adopting the service model as opposed to the power model doesn't need empathy consultants, because part of the leadership task is to listen, to relate, and incidentally to care for the people that you lead, to ensure their well-being, as well as to establish what their views and expectations, what their dreams are. I mean, another way of putting it is to say the service model of leadership is a person saying, how can we cooperatively help to make your dreams come true?
Okay. The next question comes from Jeff. Now, Jeff was wondering, how can we teach our children to be successful through kindness in a world that is increasingly driven by perceptions, egos, and ignorance?
All right, thank you, Jeff. The world that you've described, and I think that's a reasonably accurate description of how Western society has been going. But the world you've described is the world that I was talking to Ailsa about when I was talking about those social trends that have been reshaping us in the direction of social fragmentation, a more competitive ethos, a more rampant individualism. And the reason I'm pleading for a revolution is to say we've been handed this golden opportunity to interrupt that trend and to say we learned how to be kind under the pressure of a crisis. So let's not forget that. And by the way, I should just say as an aside to this, people are kind all the time. I mean, it's not just in a crisis. I'm sure all of us know examples from every day, thousands, all happening all around us. People are behaving beautifully. It's just that we need to make a greater commitment to it in order to resist the effect of these social changes that have been atomizing us and driving us in the direction of individualism. So when it comes to our kids, to Jeff's point, first of all, remember what I was saying about the need to nurture the inherent, innate capacity for kindness. We do need, from the very beginning, to be encouraging our children and our grandchildren and our neighbours' children and the children in our class to be thinking about kindness as the most precious capacity they have. So when the kids come home from school, we don't say, what did you learn today? We say, what was the kindest thing you did today? Who was kind to you today? Who were you kind to? To keep using that kind of language so we begin to integrate into the child's view of how the world works and what happens when they're with other people, that kindness is the core discipline. It's the core capacity that needs to be nurtured. So that can be encouraged in schools. Above all else, it can be encouraged at home. The parental example is absolutely crucial and enduring. And if parents are saying, what was the kindest thing you did at school today, and their own behaviour suggests to their children that they're not behaving very kindly to each other or talking kindly about other people and so on, then what they say to their kids will be immaterial compared with the influence of that example. So nurturing kindness in ourselves and particularly in the rising generation of children. And just to relate back to the couple of questions we had earlier relating to social media, let's remember that part of the business of encouraging kindness in kids is encouraging kids to spend time with each other and to recognise that when they're trading off too much of that time in favour of online time, they are actually flirting with health hazards, particularly as they move through adolescence, because social isolation is so closely associated with anxiety, depression, loneliness, sleep disturbance, inflammation, hypertension, vulnerability to addiction, a long list of health hazards. We need to be warning our kids from an early age that those health hazards exist with the overuse of a medium that promotes unkindness.
Now, I hope you indulge me because I know that it is after 7:30, but this is such a lovely conversation that I would like time for one more question. We'll have a question in our audience. So, yeah, we've got a few hands. So, here we go.
Thanks for the chat, Hugh. It's been really interesting. I've got a question. You're obviously very, very positive about kindness, and you've been studying social behaviours and kindness for a long time. Has that always been the case in terms of your positivity around kindness, or has there been events or times in the past where you can look back and say you were genuinely concerned around the kindness that existed in our society?
Yes. I've been through a bit of an evolution myself. A lot of my social research over the years, in terms of big trends, has worried me, sometimes depressed me, made me very concerned about where our society was going as I saw trends propelling the movement towards more individualism, more competitiveness, more materialism. I thought, where will this end? And I've looked to other countries around the world, particularly the US, further ahead of us, a long way ahead of us on the same track, a rampantly individualistic society with all the social problems that flow from that. And I thought, surely we don't want to go there. But the thing that has sustained me throughout all this is that, generally speaking, when I've spoken to individuals, when I've interviewed people, when I've listened to groups of friends and neighbours and colleagues having discussions about these topics that I described earlier, almost always I've been inspired by the sense that they're all trying to do their best, that they really do want to be good parents, they really do want to be good neighbours, good citizens, good employees, but at the micro level, the spirit of kindness, cooperation, goodwill, respect never went away. But it's just that the big trends were propelling people into a hazardous zone where those things were put at risk by atomisation, by the breakdown of neighbourhoods and so on. But I've certainly recognised that moments of a crisis for individuals have generally turned out to be good. But not that we seek crisis, we don't wish pain on our children, we don't court failure because we know it'll be good for us to fail. But the folklore says we grow through pain, and the folklore is right. We are, when we are lulled into a sense of complacency by 28 years of continuous economic growth, or by being in love, or some other thing that makes us think, oh, isn't this wonderful? We don't learn much from that. But then when we hit a bit of turbulence, when something goes wrong, when we have to deal with an obstacle of some kind, that does tend in the end to bring out the best in us and to give us the resilience to resist the impact of those changes that would otherwise push us apart. So it's a mixed sort of answer, but certainly when the bushfires happened, before, I mean, I was committed to writing this book before COVID-19 arrived. I was in consultation with the publisher about a book about how we respond to crises and how that relates to some other themes of my work over all these years. And then we were presented with a national social laboratory in the form of COVID-19, where the whole thing played out so vividly, and acknowledging what Ailsa said earlier, that many people suffered, but the overall magnificent response of Australians to this, I think, is one of those rare causes for a little bit of national pride.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and for those who joined us online as well. I could see we had people from Albury and Queanbeyan and even far north Queensland as well. So really chuffed to be able to do this. And this is the first time that the New South Wales Public Libraries Network has done a hybrid event in person and online. So thanks for joining us. Make sure that applause gets sent to all those who you can't see but are working very tirelessly in the background from various library networks all over New South Wales to make sure that all the online things are going smoothly. But copies of The Kindness Revolution are available for purchase by the lovely Elizabeth at the back from the Woollhara bookshop, and also online through Booktopia as well. And for those of you joining us online, a link has been sent in the chat with the direct link to that listing. And of course, Hugh's books, all of his books are available at our libraries for borrowing all across New South Wales. So tonight's conversation has been recorded and it will be available on YouTube through the New South Wales Library Events YouTube channel. And we look forward to having you join us again next time. Thank you.